G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. This study, The Remnant of Israel, Past, Present and Future, is a study which has been prepared by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. So we're into part 3 of a 4-part series on the Remnant of Israel, Past, Present and Future. So we're going to look at, continue to look at Romans 9, 10, 11. We're into chapter 10, verses 1 to 11 at the moment. We're going to look at Israel's ignorance of the channel of salvation. So after we dealt with the stumbling of the people, Paul then spells out the reason behind it. And that was due to these lines of ignorance. And each line of ignorance will build upon the previous one. So here we see in verses 1 to 2, Paul's personal desire. He says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and my supplication to God is for them, that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge." So as Paul began to explain the Jews' ignorance of the channel of salvation, he again expressed a personal desire, as he did in the beginning of chapter 9. In verse 1, he addresses his readers as brethren. And what that is doing, remember, he's writing to the Roman church. So what he's doing is he's uniting all believers with himself in this desire. So all believers then should share this same desire. And regarding that burden and desire, Paul stated, "My supplication to God is for them," the Jewish people, "that they may be saved." So the thing for which Paul kept praying was that the Jewish people might be saved. So Paul's desire was to be able to see the salvation of the Jewish people, not only on a national level, but also on an individual level. And then in verse 2, Paul continues. He then bears witness for the Jewish people. He testifies that the Jewish people do have a zeal for God, and this zeal is the cause of Paul's pain. The problem was that their zeal was not according to knowledge, because sincerity is not enough. And this verse here becomes the key to this division, just as Romans 9:6 was the key to the first main division. While the Jewish people had a knowledge of God, they did not know God in the Messiah. And that is crucial for salvation. And in the Greek text, Paul wrote that they had gnosis, meaning knowledge, but they did not have epignosis, which means full knowledge. And this is the same point that Hosea made. The reason Israel is lost is because of a lack of knowledge of spiritual truth. And this is exactly what Hosea 4:6 says. He says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge," lack of spiritual knowledge, spiritual truth. And now in verses 3 to 5, we look at the legal righteousness. Paul goes on to say, he says, "For being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness to everyone that believes. For Moses writes that the man that does the righteousness which is of the law shall live thereby." So Paul once again emphasizes their failure in that they fail to attain the righteousness which is of the law. And then in verse 3, their failure lies in the fact that they were ignorant of God's righteousness. So this is a sentence of justification, which is conferred upon those who believe. But they did not seek God's righteousness. They did not seek to be declared righteous by faith. Rather, they sought to establish their own righteousness. Now, this is the sentence of justification sought by the way an individual kept the law. So these Jews who were zealous, they sought to establish their righteousness to their own glory by works. And as soon as they had tried to establish righteousness by their own works, it meant that they refused to subject themselves to the righteousness of God. Because the righteousness of God is attained by grace through faith plus nothing. And this turned out to be an act of disobedience. Paul then explains the reason for it in verse 4. For Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness. Now, the Greek word translated end is telos, T-E-L-O-S. It's a Greek word that can mean two things. It can mean termination, that the Messiah is a termination of the law. And secondly, the word telos can also mean goal, that the goal of the law was the Messiah. So the law was not an end in itself. Rather, it was intended to bring one to faith in the Messiah. And from other passages, it is clear that both are true. The Messiah was the goal of the law to bring one to faith. We see in Galatians 3:10 to 4:7. The death of Yeshua also brought the law to an end, which we see in 2 Corinthians 3:1 to 8 and Hebrews 7:11 to 18. The primary meaning of the word is termination. And within the context of the book of Romans, Paul has already stated that the law of Moses no longer has any authority over the believer. And he told us back in Romans 7, Romans 7 verses 4 to 6, Romans 7, 4 to 6. In either case, Israel, the whole, failed on both counts. Israel failed to realize that the goal of the law was faith in the Messiah, and that the law had ended as a rule of life. Now, the law was never ever a means of salvation. It was always a rule of life. But they also failed to realize that the law was rendered inoperative and that Jesus was to be seen as the one through whom man now attains righteousness, not by the works of the law. And they failed to see this. The law was never ever a means of salvation. And now, to prove his point in verse 5, Paul quotes Leviticus 18, verse 5, where Moses himself saw the impossibility of keeping the law. And in this particular passage in Leviticus 18:5, the contrast is not between the law and faith. The contrast is between righteousness proceeding from the law and righteousness proceeding from faith. No man attains righteousness that proceeds from the law because he fails to keep the law perfectly. No one can keep the law perfectly except for Yeshua. Therefore, the only way man is now justified or declared righteous is if he proceeds on the basis of faith. Legal righteousness is trying to attain righteousness by the works of the law and failing to see that salvation can only be granted by grace through faith in the Messiah. Now we see the faith righteousness in verses 6 to 11. Paul now begins with a description of faith righteousness, but this is verses 6 to 7 we start with. But the righteousness which is of faith says thus, say not in your heart, who shall ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or verse 7, or who shall descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. So in these verses, Paul quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 12 to 13, where Moses explained that the nearness of God's righteousness. He said that one does not need to go up into heaven to bring it down, or to go down into the abyss in order to bring it up. What Moses said to Israel is here applied to Messiah. To obtain the righteousness, one does not need to go either into heaven or to hell, because it is all apart from human merit. Man does not need to initiate the incarnation to bring Christ down, for this has already been done. Nor does man need to initiate the resurrection to bring Christ up, for this also has already been done. So faith righteousness we see here is not initiated by any human merit. Then Paul quotes Deuteronomy 30 verse 14, which spells out the means of faith righteousness in verse 8. But what says it? The word is nigh you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. So the means is in your mouth and in your heart. What does that do? It shows its nearness and its accessibility. The word of faith is the message, and the subject of the message is faith. So this is the message or gospel that Paul has been preaching. Paul explains the one thing that is essential to salvation, and that is belief in verses 9 to 11. Because if you shall confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and shall believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart man believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture says, whosoever believes on him shall not be put to shame. So verses 9 to 10 reveal how belief will naturally flow out in confession. With the mouth, one confesses Jesus as Lord. With the heart, he believes that God raised him from the dead. So with the heart, man believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth, confession is made unto salvation. So this is, it's in Hebrew, is a chiastic construction. It goes mouth, heart, heart, mouth. And it means that believing and confessing occur at the very same time. So confession is not something one does later as part of gaining salvation. Belief in the heart brings righteousness and justification, and then the confession is then made to God. And the content of this confession is that Yeshua died for our sins, was buried, and rose again. And the content of faith is that Jesus is Savior, and this is what one confesses the moment he believes. Then in verse 11, Paul then quotes from Isaiah 28:16 to prove that faith is the only condition for salvation. For the scripture saith, whosoever believeth on him shall not be put to shame. And the point of his argument is that the universal way of attaining salvation is through faith. Now, what we're going to see here now is Israel's ignorance of the universal character of salvation. We're going to see this in verses 12 to 13 of chapter 10. For there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, and is rich unto all that call upon him. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so the first line of ignorance that we see here, this led to the faulty conclusion. And the second line of ignorance, that God intended to save only Jews. Earlier on, Paul proved that salvation in the Old Testament was to those who believed, not on the basis of human works. And in verse 12, Paul now proves that salvation is universal to all who believe, because salvation is free. It is necessary universal. It is free to both Jews and Gentiles alike, insofar as the way a man is saved. There is no distinction. Remember, in Romans 3:22 to 23, he pointed out that all are sinners, both Jews and Gentiles. No distinction with sin. Now he points out that all may be saved, both Jews and Gentiles. The Lord of the Jews is also the Lord of the Gentiles. He is the same Lord. And this Lord is rich in his gracious dealings and graciously responds to all that call upon him. And then to prove it, in verse 13, Paul quotes from Joel chapter 2, verse 32. Joel 2:32, which is the evidence of universality, in that anyone who will call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Anyone, Jew or Gentile. And in verse 12, the emphasis here is upon the character of God. He is Lord of all. In verse 13, the emphasis is on the promise of God. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And this includes both Jews and Gentiles. Now, Paul is not saying here that all distinctions between Jews and Gentiles have been erased. The point here is that as far as salvation, as far as the way one is saved, there is no distinction. Everybody, Jew or Gentile, Jew and Gentile, they're all saved by grace through faith. It's the only way of salvation, through faith. But Israel's ignorance of the universal character of salvation caused them to stumble over belief in the Messiahship of Yeshua. Since the law was given to the Jews and not to the Gentiles, the Jewish people wrongly concluded that God intended to save Jews, but not the Gentiles. And they wrongly concluded that salvation was not available to Gentiles unless they took upon themselves fully the works of the law. They assumed that if they kept the law, they'd be saved. However, salvation was never ever on the basis of the law. It was always on the basis of grace through faith. And this is true for both Jews and Gentiles. We also see now Israel's ignorance of the universal preaching of the gospel. We see this in verses 14 to 21 of chapter 10. So the second line of ignorance, which we just saw, now led to the third line of ignorance, and that was that there was no need to proclaim a message of salvation to the Gentiles, since God intended to save only Jews. So in this section is another proof that the stumbling of Israel was the fault of Israel. It was not God's fault. The nature of salvation, which is just explained, necessitated that it be preached without distinction. This freedom of the offer of salvation to all proved to be a stumbling block to unbelieving Jewish people. But they did not have the excuse of not having heard. And he presents the chain of the preaching in verses 14 to 15. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? Even as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that bring glad tidings of good things. Now, each question we see here is a link in the chain of the argument, and each conclusion is tacitly assumed. It's forming the grounds or basis for the next question. And he points out four things in these questions. First of all, there is no calling upon the name of the Lord without faith. Secondly, there can be no faith without hearing. Faith must have content, and one must hear the content of faith before he can believe. Thirdly, there is no hearing without preaching. And fourthly, there is no preaching without sending. A universal gospel is a necessary corollary to a universal salvation, and that requires a universal proclamation of the gospel. Now, Israel rejected the preaching, and their ignorance was the cause of rejection. And here Paul quotes from Isaiah 52:7 to show that the message had been preached, but it was simply not believed because of the previous problem, their ignorance of the universal character of salvation. And because of that, they failed to preach salvation through faith to the Gentiles. Yet there can be no calling without faith, no faith without hearing, no hearing without preaching, and no preaching without sending. And because of Israel's failure to do the sending, the Gentiles did not hear, a fact that was not true of Israel, for Paul shows that the message was heard in verses 16 to 18. But they did not all hearken to the glad tidings. For Isaiah said, Lord, who has believed our report? So belief comes of hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. But I say, did they not hear? Yes, verily. Their sound went out into all the earth, and their words unto the ends of the world. So in verse 16, the word we see here, hearken, but did they not all hearken? It means obey. It's a voluntary submission. Did they not all obey the glad tidings? Paul points out that they failed to voluntarily submit to the demands of the gospel. And he then quotes Isaiah 53 verse 1. And that was to prove that there was a failure to obey. And this chapter of Isaiah deals with Israel's rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. That's Isaiah 53. In verse 17, he speaks of the relationship between faith and blessing. The relationship is that one must have a message to believe. But how is he going to believe a message unless he hears it? So belief of a message comes by hearing, and hearing is by the word of God. But I say, verse 18, but I say, did they not hear? Yea, verily, Yes, they did. Their sound went out into all the earth, and their words onto the ends of the world. So in verse 18, he shows that the Jews had the message. So the problem was not a lack of hearing, but it was a lack of obedience. And then Paul quotes Psalm 19, verse 4, to show that the Jewish people were inexcusable. For the message that came only through nature or general revelation should have brought them to faith. But they had more than just the message of nature preached to them. They had the gospel, which was special revelation. And by this time, by Paul's day, the gospel had been preached in virtually every Jewish community. And this shows that Israel had heard the gospel. And then in verses 19 to 20, Paul quotes Old Testament prophecy. He quotes Deuteronomy 32, verse 21, and Isaiah 65, verse 1. And these two anticipated a salvation that would be sent out to every nation, and that Gentiles among those nations would receive it. Here's verse 19 and 20. But I say, did Israel not know? First Moses said, I will provoke you to jealousy with that which is no nation. With a nation void of understanding will I anger you. And Isaiah is very bold and said, I was found of them that sought me not. I became manifest unto them that asked not of me. So the message that the Jewish people were rejecting, Gentiles were accepting. So those who believe will constitute a new entity that in turn will provoke Jews to jealousy. And this is a point Paul will detail when we get to Romans 11, verses 11 to 14. So this new group, however, is not a nation. It is no nation, for it's composed of believers from all nations. And he then concludes by quoting Isaiah 65, verse 2. And that's to show that even though Israel rejected him, God's attitude toward Israel was still one of love. In verse 21, he says, But as to Israel, he said, all the day long did I spread out my hands onto a disobedient and gainsaying people. God keeps his hands open continuously. Anytime Israel wants to respond, he will accept them. Israel has rejected the Lord, but the Lord has not rejected Israel. He is still waiting to receive Israel. Now we get into chapter 11 and we see the consolation of Israel's rejection in chapter 11, verses 1 to 24. Now in the first 10 verses, we're going to see that the rejection by Israel is not total. Verse 1, I say then, did God cast off his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. The word then, where it says I say then, connects verse 1 with Romans 10:21 that portrays Israel in unbelief. And Paul begins with a question. Did God cast off his people? And this question is based on the statement in Romans 10:21 and shows that the people of these two verses must be the same. It's national Israel. And in these verses, Paul taught that Israel's rejection of the Messiahship of Yeshua is not complete or total, because even today there are Jewish people coming to a saving knowledge of the Messiahship of Yeshua. The answer comes quickly from Paul. God forbid, or more strongly in the Greek, may it never be. Perish the thought, he says. The problem was not that God had cast off his people. The fact that Israel rejected the Messiahship of Yeshua does not mean that God has rejected Israel. Even in unbelief, they are still his people. As Paul states, God did not cast off his people. If he had, it would mean that no single Jew could ever be saved. And to prove it, Paul first cites himself as an example. The fact that Paul himself was a Jewish believer showed two things. First, it showed that Israel's rejection of the Messiah was not total. And second, it showed that God has not rejected or cast off his people. Otherwise, Paul would not have been saved. Although the majority do not believe, Still, God has not cast off his people. He has not rejected his elect nation. The fact that Paul refers to Israel as his people in the present age shows that they are still the chosen people. Paul then brings it the choice of God in the first part of verse 2. God did not cast off his people which he foreknew. So the relationship between God and his people is that of foreknowledge. God had, in his foreknowledge, chosen Israel in spite of his knowledge that Israel would reject the messiahship of Yeshua. And the very concept of the foreknowledge of God forbids the concept of casting off of Israel. Since Israel was chosen, God could not cast off Israel. And then to show that Paul was not alone in his Jewish faith of the messiahship of Yeshua, he next deals with the calling of the remnant in second part of verse 2, going down to verse 10. There are many other Jews who have come to saving faith, both in the past and at the present time. Paul gives the historical example of Elijah back in verses 2 to 4. Or know ye not what the scripture said of Elijah? How he pleaded with God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have digged down your altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what said the answer of God unto him? I have left for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. The point here is to show that God has always had a remnant, although the remnant may have been quite small at times. While apostasy was general, it was not universal among Jews. The point Paul is making with the example of Elijah is that what is true today has always been true. It is the remnant that comes to saving faith. The remnant in Elijah's day was only 7,000 strong. What has happened since the ministry of Jesus is nothing new, because throughout Jewish history, the majority have always been in a state of unbelief. So now, after giving the example of Elijah, Paul then gave the application in verse 5. Even so, then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. The expression even so is now the comparison, and the word then is the inference. What was true then is true now. There is a remnant according to the election of grace. And by declaring that it is the election of grace, Paul then gave the standard according to which the remnant comes into existence. It is not on the basis of the law of Moses, and we saw that back in Romans 10:4, but it is on the basis of grace and grace alone. And Paul uses the Greek present tense, which shows that the remnant has existed in the past and it still exists in the present. The present remnant of verse 5 corresponds to the 7,000 men of Elijah's day. And this remnant is the Israel of God, which we see in Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. He then gives the explanation in verse 6. But if it is by grace, it is no more of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. So he drives the point home here that grace and works are mutually exclusive. This is the same point he made in chapter 10. If it is by grace, it cannot be of works. The reason is that it would make grace no longer grace. No one, not even the Jew, can make any claim on God. But God will save men only by grace through faith among both Jews and among the Gentiles. Insofar as the basis of salvation is concerned, law and grace, works and faith are mutually exclusive. Paul then draws a logical conclusion in verse 7. What then? That which Israel sought for, that he obtained not. But the election obtained it, and the rest were hardened. What then? What then? The inference here is that which Israel, the whole, entire Israel, sought, he obtained not. Israel the whole sought righteousness. But as Romans chapter 9, 31 to 33 pointed out, they sought this righteousness on the basis of their own works and the works of the law. And that's why they did not obtain it. They were trying to get it by works. But the elect obtained righteousness while the rest were hardened. Again, the distinction here is not between the church and Israel or between Jews and Gentiles, but it is between Jews who believe and Jews who do not believe. That which Israel the whole failed to obtain, Israel the remnant did obtain. Jewish believers have obtained this righteousness of God. This same point was made in 1 Peter 2, 1 to 10, which we saw, I think, back in the first study. Now, while Israel the whole has failed to obtain the righteousness of God, there is a remnant within Israel that has not failed. It is this remnant, the Jewish believers, that is the Israel of God. Again, the distinction is between the remnant, the election that obtained it, and the non-remnant, the rest who were hardened. And verses 8 to 10, Paul then quotes from the Old Testament to show that the present hardening of Israel was anticipated by all three divisions of the Old Testament. According as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor. This is from Isaiah 29:10. Eyes that they, and now we come to Deuteronomy 29:4. Eyes that they should not see and ears that they should not hear unto this very day. Now we go into the Psalms. So we have the prophets in Isaiah. We have the law in Deuteronomy, and now we have the writings in the Psalms. And Psalm 69, 22 to 23. And David said, let their table be made a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, and bow you down their back always. So he quotes law in Deuteronomy, prophets in Isaiah 29, and the writings in Psalm 69 to show that Israel as a whole has been hardened. The point of Romans 11, 1 to 10 then is that while Israel as a nation has failed to attain righteousness, this rejection of the Messiahship of Yeshua is not a total rejection. There are Jewish people who do believe, and these Jewish believers have attained the righteousness of God. At the present time, there are Jewish believers that are the remnant according to the election of grace. So instead of using the existence of a minority of believers as evidence that God has cast off his people, in reality, it is evidence that he has not cast off his people. Now we move on to the purpose of Israel's stumbling, which we see in verses 11 to 15. Paul again raises a question to be refuted in verse 11. I say then, did they stumble that they might fall? God forbid. The expression I say then raises the question, did they stumble that they might fall? Was Israel stumbling in Romans 9, 30 to 33 for the purpose of Israel's falling? Was the purpose so that God could reject and cast off his people? Paul is referring to the majority that did stumble. The Greek word that Paul used for fall here refers to a complete and irrevocable fall. So was the stumbling of Israel for the purpose that Israel would irrevocably fall and never rise again? Paul then gave the answer, God forbid. Again, may it never be. Perish the thought, he says. In the light of God's faithfulness, this is totally unthinkable. They have stumbled, but it was not for the purpose of falling irrevocably. God planned for Israel to stumble for the purpose of Gentile salvation. But Gentile salvation is subservient or subordinate to Jewish salvation. Now, having said this, second part of verse 11 to 15, Paul then spelled out the purpose of Gentile salvation. But by their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if their fall is the riches of the world and their loss the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? But I speak to you that are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I glorify my ministry. By any means I may provoke to jealousy them that are my flesh, and may save some of them. So in the second part of verse 11, the purpose here is to provoke Jews to jealousy. And this is a reference to Deuteronomy 32, verse 21, already cited in Romans 10:19. The answer to the question, why is God saving Gentiles today? It is to provoke the Jews to jealousy. The expression here, provoke to jealousy, is a Greek word that means to come alongside someone, causing him to boil or seethe with jealousy. And the reason God is saving Gentiles is so that a believing Gentile will come alongside an unbelieving Jewish person and cause the Jewish person to become jealous because of what the Gentile believer has, so that he becomes a believer in the Messiah also. And then verse 12 presents a contrast between the partial and the fullness. Concerning the partial, there is now a reduction of the nation to a remnant of believers today. But in the future, there will be a national salvation of the nation as a whole, and this will be their fullness. Paul points out that since Israel's stumbling was for the purpose of Gentile salvation, which is the riches of the world, the riches of the Gentiles, this fact should lead to some key lessons. The first lesson to learn about the purpose of Israel's stumbling is that Israel did not stumble for an irrevocable fall. Rather, it was so salvation could now go out to the Gentiles. And now that salvation has gone out to the Gentiles, the purpose of Gentile salvation is to provoke the Jews to jealousy and thus bring them to salvation in verses 13 to 14. The purpose of Israel's stumbling was Gentile salvation. The purpose for Gentile salvation is Jewish salvation. This is the method by which God has chosen to work. There's a second lesson to be learned about the purpose of Israel's stumbling in verse 15. For if the casting away of them is the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? So the second lesson here is that all of this will result in blessings for Israel. Paul states that if the stumbling of Israel meant the reconciliation of the Gentile world, then the receiving of Israel would mean life from the dead. And this is the statement of Israel's place in God's blessing. The unbelief of Israel was directed toward the restoration of faith. The fall of Israel was directed toward their ultimate reclamation. Their fullness of verse 12 refers to Israel's complete restoration. If by the fall of Israel the Gentiles receive the gospel, how much more will the Gentiles be blessed by Israel's return? This is an argument from the lesser to the greater. If the Gentiles have received this much blessing by virtue of Israel's stumbling, just think how much more blessing the Gentiles will have when Israel is saved. This will lead to the second coming and the establishment of the kingdom. This is why Paul labored so hard among the Gentiles. In this way, even more Jews will be provoked to jealousy and believe. And this in turn will mean even more blessings for the Gentiles. The point Paul makes in this section is that it was God's plan for Israel to reject the Messiahship of Jesus for a while. The gospel would then go out to the Gentiles, during which time they were to provoke Jews to jealousy until eventually all Israel is saved. Paul builds upon Isaiah 49, 1 to 13, where Isaiah taught the very same thing. Isaiah taught that the Messiah would come to Israel, Israel would reject him, and Messiah would then for a while become the light to the Gentiles. But eventually, Israel will return to him and be restored. Now, Paul does not say anything new here. He just points out the way Isaiah 49 is being fulfilled in this day. In verses 1 to 10, Paul taught that there is still a remnant coming to saving faith. Now, in verses 11 to 15, he states that the primary way Jews now come to faith is by being provoked to jealousy by Gentile believers. And that's where we're going to leave this study. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.